My father stood up during the father-daughter dance at my wedding, gently took the microphone from the DJ, and smiled at the crowd like he was about to share a heartfelt memory. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Before this marriage goes any further, everyone deserves to know the truth. Hannah isn't my biological daughter." The music stopped so suddenly it felt like the room had forgotten how to breathe. 180 guests turned toward me at once. My husband Ethan's hand tightened around mine, but he didn't let go. Across the ballroom, my stepmother, Linda, quietly lowered her wine glass with the smallest smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, while my stepbrother Kyle was already holding up his phone, recording every second as though he'd known exactly what was about to happen. My father looked proud of himself, convinced he'd just destroyed the happiest day of my life. What he didn't know was that 6 months earlier, after my grandmother Eleanor passed away, she'd left me a sealed envelope with one handwritten instruction across the front. "Open this only when your father finally tells his biggest lie." I hadn't understood what she meant back then, but I'd carried that envelope with me ever since. Tonight, tucked safely inside my wedding planner, it was only a few feet away. He thought exposing me would make everyone turn against me. He had no idea that my grandmother had spent years preparing me for this exact moment, carefully preserving documents, letters, and one truth that could destroy the perfect image my father had built for over 3 decades. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where family secrets don't stay buried forever, and the people who think they've won often discover they're standing on the weakest ground. If stories about betrayal, hidden truths, and unforgettable wedding day revenge are your kind of stories, make yourself comfortable because this one takes a turn nobody saw coming. My name is Hannah Brooks. I'm 31 years old. And for the last 12 years, I've worked as a high school history teacher in a quiet town outside Nashville. I spend my days teaching teenagers that every historical event has 2 versions: the story people tell publicly and the truth buried underneath it. I just never imagined my own family had been living inside one of those lessons. My students always joked that nothing surprised me because I'd seen every excuse and every dramatic meltdown a teenager could invent. They weren't completely wrong. Teaching taught me patience. It taught me how to stay calm when everyone else was emotional, how to listen before speaking, and how to wait for facts instead of reacting to feelings. Those habits followed me home, where they slowly became something my family depended on. I was always the dependable one, the daughter, who never argued, the sister who fixed everyone's problems, the woman who smiled through disappointment because keeping the peace seemed easier than asking difficult questions. After my mother died when I was only 8 years old, my father remarried Linda less than 2 years later. She arrived with her 6-year-old son, Kyle, and from the beginning I was expected to become the understanding older sister who never complained about sharing attention, sharing birthdays, or eventually sharing almost everything else. Whenever something belonged to me, somehow it slowly became ours. My room became the guest room whenever Linda's relatives visited. My college savings quietly helped Kyle attend a private school because, according to my father, I was responsible enough to earn scholarships. Every sacrifice was presented as proof of my maturity. Every disappointment became another reminder that family comes first. I believed it because I wanted to believe my father would never ask me for something he wouldn't also give me if our situations were reversed. Looking back now, I realize that's how manipulation often works. It doesn't arrive as cruelty. It arrives disguised as love, responsibility, and loyalty until you can't tell where generosity ends and exploitation begins. Then I met Ethan 3 years before our wedding at a charity book drive our school, organized with his architecture firm. He wasn't loud or charming in the way movies like to pretend romance begins. He simply noticed details everyone else ignored. He remembered the names of the janitors. He stacked chairs after events without being asked. On our 3rd date, he told me, "Buildings don't collapse overnight. Small cracks get ignored until one day everyone acts surprised." I laughed because he was talking about old houses. I had no idea he'd eventually notice the cracks inside my own family long before I ever did. 6 months before the wedding, while we were discussing finances and planning our future together, Ethan casually asked why my father still controlled the trust my grandmother had established years earlier. I shrugged and repeated the explanation I'd heard my entire adult life. "Dad says it's easier if he manages everything until after the wedding." Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded, the way engineers do when something doesn't make structural sense, but they aren't ready to accuse anyone of dishonesty yet. Later that night, he quietly asked one question that stayed with me for weeks. If the money has always been yours, why does someone else get to decide when you can have it? I didn't have an answer. I only had the habit of trusting my father, the same habit that had shaped every important decision I'd ever made. I had no idea that while I was choosing flowers, tasting wedding cakes, and writing thank you cards, my father and stepmother were planning a speech they believed would destroy my reputation forever before I even had the chance to say, I do. My father's question stayed in my mind long after Ethan asked it, but every time I considered pushing for answers, life found another distraction. There were wedding invitations to mail, seating charts to finish, and endless phone calls from vendors. My father seemed unusually generous during those weeks. He insisted on paying for the ballroom, upgraded the catering package without telling me, and kept reminding everyone how proud he was to be giving his daughter the wedding she'd always dreamed of. Looking back, I realized generosity can sometimes be camouflage. The louder someone advertises their kindness, the harder it becomes for people to imagine what they're hiding. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan and I sat at our dining room table reviewing paperwork for the future. He asked if I had copies of every account and trust connected to my name. Dad has all of that, I answered automatically. Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he smiled gently and said, Then let's simply ask for copies. Good records make good families. It sounded reasonable enough that I called my father that evening. There was a long pause after I mentioned the trust. Then he laughed in a way that felt rehearsed. Sweetheart, why are you worrying about paperwork a month before your wedding? Leave boring financial things to me. I'll hand everything over after the honeymoon. His answer should have settled the matter, but instead it left an uncomfortable silence hanging between us. 2 days later, I drove to his house anyway. Linda greeted me with her usual perfect smile, but I noticed she and my father exchanged a quick glance before inviting me inside. When I asked to see the trust documents, my father leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. You've changed since meeting Ethan, he said. You never questioned me before. I told him I wasn't questioning him. I simply wanted copies of papers that legally belonged to me. He sighed dramatically, opened a filing cabinet, and handed me only a single summary page instead of the complete file. Something about it felt incomplete. There were references to withdrawals but no explanations, dates without supporting documents, and several pages clearly missing. Ethan looked at it that evening for less than 5 minutes before quietly saying, Someone doesn't remove pages from paperwork unless they hope nobody notices. They're gone. That sentence unsettled me enough to contact the attorney who had originally handled my grandmother's estate. His assistant explained that because I was now over 30, I had every legal right to request the complete file myself. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at our apartment. I spread everything across the dining room table while Ethan organized the papers into neat stacks. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then we noticed something strange. Over the last 8 years, the trust had made dozens of withdrawals labeled as family, educational expenses, and property maintenance. The signatures approving every payment belonged to my father. The receipts attached to those withdrawals told an even stranger story. Tuition payments for Kyle's private university, renovations on my father's lake house, a luxury SUV registered in Linda's name, vacation expenses from resorts I'd never visited. One payment after another, small enough that no single withdrawal looked shocking. But together they totaled nearly $180,000. My grandmother hadn't left that money to support my father. She had left it to secure my future. Yet piece by piece it had quietly become their personal checking account. I couldn't speak for several minutes. Ethan simply continued arranging the receipts in chronological order, his expression growing calmer the more evidence appeared. This wasn't one mistake, he finally said. This was a system. The next morning, I drove to see my Aunt Rebecca, my grandmother's younger sister. She listened without interrupting while I explained everything. When I finished, she disappeared upstairs and returned, carrying a faded leather journal that had belonged to Grandma Eleanor. She hoped she'd never need this, Aunt Rebecca whispered as she placed it in my hands. Inside were years of handwritten notes. Grandma had documented conversations with my father, concerns about money disappearing, and repeated promises he'd made to repay the trust after Kyle finished school. On the final page, written only weeks before she died, was one heartbreaking sentence. If David ever tells Hannah she wasn't loved enough to deserve this inheritance, show her the envelope. It contains the truth he'll never willingly admit. My hands began shaking. What envelope? I asked. Aunt Rebecca smiled sadly. The one your grandmother instructed her lawyer to give you 6 months after her funeral. Didn't you open it? I told her I hadn't because of the instructions written across the front. Open only when your father finally tells his biggest lie. Aunt Rebecca nodded slowly. Then don't open it yet. Trust your grandmother one last time. She knew exactly what she was doing. I drove home with the journal beside me on the passenger seat, my thoughts louder than the traffic around me. That evening, my father called unexpectedly. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Everything ready for the big day? He asked. I said yes. Then he casually added, remember, families survive because they don't embarrass each other over money. I froze. I hadn't told him about the documents. Somehow he already knew I had started asking questions. Before hanging up, he said one sentence that sent a chill through me. No matter what happens at the wedding, just smile and trust me. I'm doing what's best for everyone. The line went dead before I could answer. Ethan looked at me from across the room and quietly asked, what did he say? I repeated my father's words exactly. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to our bedroom, opened the safe where we'd stored my grandmother's sealed envelope, and placed it gently inside his suit jacket. I think, he said calmly, we should keep this very close on your wedding day. Something tells me your father already has a plan. And your grandmother expected it years before either of us did. My father's words echoed in my mind for the rest of the week. No matter what happens at the wedding, just smile and trust me. The more I thought about them, the less they sounded like reassurance and the more they sounded like a warning. Ethan didn't pressure me to confront anyone. That's one of the things I loved most about him. He believed truth didn't need to be chased because eventually it walked into the room on its own. Instead, we quietly prepared. He scanned every document from my grandmother's file, made digital copies, and placed the originals in a leather folder that never left his side. The sealed envelope stayed in the inside pocket of his suit jacket. We still hadn't opened it. My grandmother had trusted that the right moment would make itself known, and somehow I believed her. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and warm, one of those perfect spring mornings where everything feels too beautiful for anything bad to happen. Friends laughed while helping me into my dress. My maid of honor kept fixing my veil, telling me I looked happier than she'd ever seen me. I smiled because it was true. Whatever happened with my family, I knew I was marrying the right man. Ethan found me alone for a moment before the ceremony. He kissed my forehead and gently tapped the inside pocket of his jacket. Still sealed, he whispered. Hopefully it stays that way. I nodded. I hope so too. Neither of us wanted drama. We wanted a marriage, not a battle. The ceremony itself was everything I'd dreamed of. Ethan's voice shook during his vows, making half the guests wipe away tears. When I promised to stand beside him through every season of life, I meant every word. For nearly an hour after the ceremony, I let myself believe the worst was behind us. We laughed with relatives, posed for photographs, and danced into the reception beneath hundreds of tiny lights hanging from the ballroom ceiling. My father smiled for every picture. Linda hugged guests as though nothing in the world could disturb our celebration. Even Kyle seemed unusually quiet, staying close to his mother while constantly checking his phone. Then dinner ended. The DJ announced it was time for the father-daughter dance. My father walked me onto the dance floor, wearing the same proud smile he'd worn all afternoon. The first verse of the song had barely finished when he suddenly stepped away from me, walked toward the DJ booth, and asked for the microphone. The music faded. Every conversation stopped. My stomach tightened before he'd even spoken a word. He looked around the ballroom, smiled sadly, and sighed into the microphone. I'm sorry, he began. I truly wanted today to stay happy. But I can't let this young man build his future on a lie. Ethan stood perfectly still beside the dance floor. Linda lowered her eyes like she couldn't bear to watch. Kyle quietly raised his phone and started recording. My father looked directly at Ethan. There's something you deserve to know before this marriage goes any further. Hannah isn't my biological daughter. A wave of shocked whispers rolled through the room. I heard gasps from every corner of the ballroom. Someone dropped a glass. My father continued before anyone could recover. I've carried this burden for 31 years. I loved her because I promised her dying mother I would. But she deserves to know the truth, and so does her husband. She has no claim to my family name, my inheritance, or anything connected to me. I stood frozen. Not because I believed him, but because I finally understood exactly what my grandmother had been preparing me for. This had never been about money alone. This was about stripping away my identity in front of everyone I'd ever loved so nobody would question what had happened to the trust. If he convinced everyone I wasn't really his daughter, then stealing from me would suddenly look like protecting his real family. The room remained painfully silent. Every eye moved between my father and me, waiting for tears, anger, or denial. Instead, I slowly turned toward Ethan. Without saying a word, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed the sealed envelope in my hands. 31 years of questions suddenly weighed almost nothing compared to that single piece of paper. I looked down at my grandmother's familiar handwriting one last time. Open only when your father finally tells his biggest lie. My fingers carefully broke the seal. Inside wasn't just one letter. There was a handwritten note, a certified birth certificate, 2 DNA reports dated decades apart, and one faded photograph of my mother holding me as a baby while my father stood beside us, smiling with unmistakable pride. Across the back of the photograph, in my grandmother's handwriting, were 7 simple words. A lie repeated for years is still a lie. I looked up at my father. For the first time all evening, the confidence disappeared from his face. He saw the papers in my hands, and he knew exactly what was inside. His smile vanished. The microphone suddenly felt much heavier in his grip, and for the first time that day, it wasn't me who looked trapped in front of 180 silent witnesses. It was him. My father stared at the papers in my hands as if they had come back from the dead. For the first time all day, he looked uncertain. His confident smile disappeared, and the room that had been hanging on his every word now waited for mine. I didn't rush. I had spent my whole life reacting to other people's decisions. Tonight, I would choose my own pace. I walked calmly toward him, took the microphone from his hand without resistance, and turned to face our guests. My grandmother, I began quietly, knew this day would come years before any of us did. That's why she left me this envelope with instructions not to open it until my father told his biggest lie. A ripple of surprise moved through the ballroom. I unfolded the first document. This is my original birth certificate. It lists David Brooks as my father. I held up the second paper. This is a DNA test my grandmother secretly arranged when I was 6 after hearing my father threatened to deny me whenever he was angry. It confirms he is my biological father with a probability greater than 99.99%. A stunned silence settled over the room. I wasn't finished. I held up the faded photograph. And this picture was taken the day I came home from the hospital. On the back, my grandmother wrote, "A lie repeated for years is still a lie." My father's shoulders slumped. He knew there was nowhere left to hide. Ethan quietly stepped beside me with the leather folder and addressed the room. "There is one more truth everyone deserves to hear," he said. "The trust Hannah's grandmother created for her future has been used for nearly 8 years to pay expenses that had nothing to do with Hannah." He handed copies of the financial records to several family members, including the pastor and 2 of my father's oldest friends. No accusations. No raised voices. Just documents. Tuition payments for Kyle, renovations on my father's lake house, Linda's luxury, SUV, vacations, more than $180,000, all withdrawn from a trust that had been meant for me. People quietly read the pages. One by one, their expressions changed. My father finally reached for the microphone again. "I can explain," he said weakly. "Everything I did was for this family." I looked at him with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "No," I answered softly. "Everything you did was for the family you chose. I was only the one paying for it," Linda stood up so quickly her chair scraped across the floor. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You're embarrassing your own father." Before I could answer, Aunt Rebecca slowly rose from her table. She had been silent all evening. "No, Linda," she said firmly. "The only people who embarrassed this family are the ones who stole from Hannah and then tried to erase her to cover it up." The room remained silent. Nobody defended my father. Nobody defended Linda. Even Kyle lowered his phone. Realizing the video he thought would humiliate me had captured every lie his parents had told. My father looked around the ballroom, searching for someone, anyone, to stand beside him. There was no one. He looked back at me, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought you'd fight back. I smiled sadly. That's because you confused kindness with weakness. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. There were no speeches left. No stories, only facts. After a long moment, he quietly placed the microphone on the DJ's table, turned toward the exit, and walked away without another word. Linda hesitated before following him. Kyle looked at me once, shame written across his face, then slowly walked after his parents. 3 empty chairs. 3 people leaving together. The ballroom stayed quiet until Pastor Miller stepped forward. He smiled warmly and said, I believe we've spent enough time talking about lies. Let's celebrate something built on truth. A few people clapped. Then more joined in. Within seconds, the applause filled the room. The DJ restarted the music and Ethan held out his hand. Mrs. Carter, he said with a grin, may I have our first dance without any more interruptions? I laughed for the first time all evening. I'd love that. We stepped onto the dance floor while our family and friends surrounded us. Not with pity, but with love. It wasn't the wedding I had imagined, but somehow it became something even more meaningful. It became the day I stopped carrying someone else's lies. A month later, with the evidence from my grandmother's files, the trust was legally transferred entirely into my name. My father was ordered to repay what he had taken over time through a court-approved settlement. He never argued. He knew he couldn't. Linda sold the lake house to help cover the repayments, and Kyle eventually wrote me a letter apologizing for staying silent. I forgave him, but forgiveness didn't erase consequences. As for the envelope, I framed my grandmother's handwritten instruction and hung it in my home office. Every morning before leaving for work, I read those words. Open only when your father finally tells his biggest lie. She had known the truth would eventually need its moment. She simply trusted me to recognize it when it arrived. I still teach history, and every year I remind my students that the truth has an advantage lies never will. Lies require constant maintenance. Truth only requires patience. My wedding taught me that the strongest revenge isn't humiliation. It isn't shouting louder than the person trying to destroy you. Sometimes the strongest revenge is standing quietly with the evidence in your hands and allowing the truth to speak for itself. My father tried to take away my name in front of 180 witnesses. Instead, he lost his own. And that was the only ending the truth ever needed.